welcome to Freedom Fighters Code Gray. This is a TV show where we discuss human trafficking, an issue that's impacting our community right here in Simcoe County. We often think of human trafficking as something that happens in other countries and other places, but in fact, the city of Barrie has double the national trafficking rate. And children as young as 12 years old are being lured and recruited for the purposes of exploitation. So today, I'm really excited to welcome and introduce our special guest, Andrea Khanjin, who is the MPP for Barrie-Innisfil. Welcome.
Great, and thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, thanks for making the time to be here. So in your own words, could you share with our viewers what is human trafficking?
I think if you look, you were mentioning you look around the world, and there might be a few different definitions of human trafficking, but globally, I think we can agree it's modern day slavery, right? You have people who are being coerced into activities they do not want to do, whether it be labor or whether it be sex work. And so I think as a society, as a global movement, we can certainly say that is modern day slavery, and it's wrong.
What is the primary types of exploitation that we see here in the province of Ontario?
Well, many of the types of exploitations, of course, you spoke about it as well in the paper that I've read, and it was well researched, and I was very delighted to read it. But you kind of, you see in Ontario, as you mentioned, it's not just about Europe or South Asia or Asia. It's really happening in our backyard here in Ontario and here in Barrie. And the fact is, whether it's young kids that are being lured or groomed to be in sex trafficking, or whether it's people who are being asked to do labor that they're not getting paid for. Sometimes they are coming from other countries and they think they're coming here for a certain job, and unfortunately they get coerced into other types of fields. And that part of trafficking is both women and men. With the sex trafficking, as you know, it is predominantly women, but it's not excluding men that are part of it as well. And from what we've seen through evidence in Ontario, through Statistics Canada, is a lot of young girls that are being trafficked and sold for sex. And it's definitely something, provincially and all across Canada, we need to do better at, and we need to recognize that it is a heinous crime, it is disgusting, and certainly we need to bring more dignity to our young girls and women across the province and in Barrie, and know the signs.
And 99% of people who are trafficked for exploitation are women and girls. But I appreciate you noting there are men who are trafficked, and there are boys who are trafficked for the purposes of sexual exploitation. But also you mentioned forced labor, and we know that's an issue that's happened right here in the city of Barrie within the year of 2019. Do you mind shedding light on the labor trafficking case where there's 43 individuals that were impacted by forced labor?
Certainly, it's one of those news stories that happened where Barrie was put on the map, and certainly it's not something to be very proud about. However, we can be proud that we did have the team of our local police officers, Barrie Police, RCMP, and CSIS. They all worked in tandem to crack this labor ring. And so that actually shows you the importance of working across not only different boundaries, because as you know, sex traffickers don't know different boundaries. Barrie, Innisfil, Toronto, Newmarket, it doesn't matter for them. They're in the business of trafficking. And same when it comes to police jurisdictions. And so we do need to work both on the federal and provincial level, local police, provincial police, and of course, at the federal level, RCMP and CSIS, to get that intelligence. And intelligence is so important. It's something that our government is putting an emphasis on, and working with our federal counterparts to gather that type of intel and to be able to follow the trail, follow the money, so that we can, like this ring of labor was discovered. These people were living in a home where mattresses were on the ground, and no bedding, nothing. Very malnutrition, a lot of abuse was occurring, and so this is something that they were tracking on different levels of intelligence for some time, and were finally able to crack the case and lay charges. But what I learned was the very complicated part of that case, according to CSIS, RCMP, and local police, was the tough part was at what point can they lay charges, and I think that is a conversation that's still ongoing when we talk about human trafficking, because you may know it's occurring, and certainly the police know it's occurring, but at one point, can you intervene so that you have enough evidence to lay charges and do something about it? Because often, and it's terrible to say, if they intervene too early, yes, they're saving those victims for a period of time, but the people that are trafficking them could escape and be doing it to other people. And so it's not to say that they didn't care about those victims, it's just they had to wait for that right moment to intervene and be able to charge the traffickers so they're not victimizing other people, and then save those who were currently victimized.
And I think you touched on so many important points when just explaining that one case and all the complexities of the partners and agencies working together and the intelligence that's needed. You mentioned looking at financial transactions. I know there's FinTrack and Project Protect, where they're able to look through and partner with banks to identify traffickers, to ensure there's prosecution, to ensure the people that are inflicting this crime are being punished for what they're doing. So how did you first learn about human trafficking? How did you personally find out, and what kind of was your next step in getting involved?
Well, you're absolutely right about the financial aspect of it, and I have had some background in that a little bit as well. But how I learned about trafficking to begin with, I was an undergrad student at University of Ottawa. I was working part-time as an intern volunteer on Parliament Hill, and I met Joy Smith. She was a member of parliament from the Winnipeg area, and she ran because she was very passionate about doing something about human trafficking. For her, she learned about human trafficking through her son, and so then she started an organization and a foundation and started advocating more about it. And real impact for her was suddenly a girl came to her and said, "This is what's happening to me," and it really got real for that member of parliament. And she said, "These people are now coming to me for help and assistance. How do they get out of trafficking? What do we do as a society?" So she made it her mission for 11 plus years as a member of parliament to, her number one topic, whether it be legislative changes, regulatory changes, was to do something about human trafficking. So she was able to, in her tenure in parliament, pass very substantial legislation, things in our criminal code so we can charge people with human trafficking, which is something we couldn't have done in Canada before. Wow. And it was her that led the charge on it. So she was impactful with making changes to the criminal code, but not only doing stuff that impacts our local law here, but she went a step further. She also was able to pass legislation that involved people who go abroad. So, for example, sex tourism, right? And so it's, those individuals who are from Canada, they're going abroad and victimizing other individuals. How do we persecute those individuals when they come back? And so she really did quite a lot in her time. And so I learned a lot about it through her. And she had this evening she hosted at the Ottawa Archives, where she played this video. It was more of a movie, and it was impactful because it showed you human trafficking doesn't just happen in Asia. It happens in Vegas. It happens in Canada, and it's not just in Europe. So it follows different trafficking scenarios and cases all around the globe, and shows you that it's not just one part of the world, it's everywhere, and that it is modern day slavery. And we've done so much to abolish slavery as a human race. And unfortunately, we've regressed, and it's happening again in another form. So we do need to stop it. And so I was really, passionate about the topic when I first learned it from her. And in my ability, after, just being a part-time intern, I ended up working in other offices where I could have made an impact with policy staff, with the minister, on different things we can do for trafficking. For instance, when I worked for Minister Jason Kenney, he was the Minister of Citizenship and Immigration. And we did a lot of things to talk about forced marriages, or people were getting marriages by proxy, by girls who predominantly were very young. In our day and age, wouldn't be old enough to consent, but in certain countries that was allowed, and they were getting proxy marriages and then sponsoring those girls and bringing them to Canada. And so certainly understanding what forms of marriages we would and would not recognize in Canada to save people from that type of trafficking, and it was very much trafficking. So we were able to do a lot of substantial changes that way. And then I worked for the Minister of Finance, Joe Oliver, and certainly we were doing a lot of work with International Task Force and of course with FinTrack in order to add more teeth and more funding to tracking transactions that involve human trafficking.
Wow. Thank you so much for just taking the time to share how you learned about trafficking. But then, after Joy Smith was really leading and helping ensure there's policy change and efforts made within government to fight trafficking in that important way, and then you got to work alongside so many other people within politics to ensure that there's a change not only locally but globally. So thank you so much for all the important work that you're involved in. Something that you shared that I wanted to highlight is you mentioned two things: sex tourism and forced marriage. And some folks, some viewers may have never heard of those terms before. Do you mind explaining what is sex tourism and what is forced labor, and how does that intersect with our society as Ontarians and Canadians?
So I'll just, it occurs in different genders, but for the purposes of the explanation, I'll say there are men in Canada that know they can go to certain countries where they don't have age of consent law. And so for them, they can lure young girls, and in some cases it is young boys, and there's certainly lots of case studies on that as well, and abuse them and molest them. And while they're on vacation, they know they can go to places. The one country that comes to mind is Thailand, for instance, but it also happens in Latin America as well. And they know they can go to these countries and get away with indecency and acts that we would find atrocious and heinous here in Canada. And they can come back and it's fine and they have a clean record. And so there was no way for RCMP or CBSA to sort of put a pin on their passport to know that this person, this individual, we suspect as intelligence on human trafficking, we suspect they are going for sex tourism. And how do we track that individual? And so there was no way for that system to talk, the passport of that individual, to talk with the acts that they are committing. And so that needed that information sharing to create evidence, and obviously the evidence leads to charges. All of that needed to be combined. So these individuals who are going for sex tourism, how does Canada track them? And so what countries are they most likely going to? And so with more intelligence investigation, what was found out was that it was a lot of countries where they don't have age of consent law like we do here. And so it is predominantly what they found was Latin America and in the Asian countries as well. But again, it could happen anywhere, but those were the two dominant cases they found of sex tourism.
So the way that Canadians are perpetuating demand is that it may not be necessarily Canadian children that are being exploited for sex tourism, but it's Canadian men, sometimes women, but mostly men, who are going overseas to purchase sexual service from minors.
Yeah.
Wow.
Because they know it's illegal here, and the worst part is that there wasn't a mechanism to, if you knew that individual was coming back to Canada, what's not to say they're not going to do the same indecent acts on our children and our youth in Canada. So, but there's no way before to charge them in Canada because they did this act somewhere else, or to revoke their driver's license or to revoke their passport for certain acts. And obviously they're most, if you think about their profile, well, they're probably most likely to do the same offensive act within our country or within our province, within our own city of Barrie.
Wow. Andrea, you are sharing so much important information that needs to be known about what human trafficking is, what it looks like in our community, how Canadians are perpetuating demand, but also, we know 90% of people trafficked within Canada are from within Canada's borders. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back to learn more about how the provincial government is fighting human trafficking here in Ontario.
After involving Nuha in this program, she feels very confident. Here you have a lot of opportunity.
I learned a lot of stuff, like being kind and I'm more open-minded.
Need an adventure this weekend?
Can I give you a little tip?
How about a free preview of Crave and HBO?
Hell yes.
Catch the biggest and best movies and all the newest series from HBO and Showtime.
Anybody order a captain?
Trust me, it's gonna be a good time.
You're welcome.
Get ready for the best entertainment with Crave. Free preview this weekend only. Don't miss out.
Through United Way, I did a self-esteem course, training for peer support, and now I volunteer. It's a lesson that comes from the nature of doing work with the United Way that gives me a new lease on my life.
welcome back to Freedom Fighters Code Gray. This is a show where we discuss human trafficking, an issue that's happening in our community here in Simcoe County and that's impacting people who live in Ontario. Today, I have with me a very special guest, Andrea Khanjin, who's our MPP for Barrie-Innisfil. So Andrea, thanks for taking the time earlier in the show to share about kind of how you found about human trafficking and just your role and your involvement to date. I'd like to spend some time now discussing what is the role of the provincial government in fighting human trafficking.
So on the provincial level, it's a great question, and certainly there's a lot we can do. Things we can do: health supports, education, through the justice system, through victim services, through Indigenous communities. There's a lot to do, and so we took it upon ourselves as government when we first got elected to really take time to understand what are all the points that need assistance. So after much consultation with, we had Laurie Scott, we had Sylvia Jones, they're both members of Provincial Parliament, Natalia Kristanova, we had Jill Dunlop, of course the Premier, so many people, Daisy Way, also a member of Parliament. We all got different people involved from different ministries because we understand we can't work in a silo and that we need to come up with different supports. And so essentially what we announced in the month of November is we announced a $20 million fund for victim services. It was the beginning of a broader strategy for human trafficking, a broader strategy that will be rolling out in due time. But it was really important to do that first step, which was everything to do with victim services. And to sort of break that down, it's everything from a rapid response team. And what is an Ontario human trafficking rapid response team? Well, if you're a victim that you're trying to come out of the human trafficking world, and there's some anecdotal evidence that someone will go back to the trafficker 5 times. So it's really tough to take them out. So what do you do to make it easier for them? Well, if you're providing things like justice supports so that they don't have to go through the court system knowing that how am I going to pay for it? So it covers a lot of expenses. It can cover up to $20,000 in expenses. Wow. But of course, if someone needs more legal help to deal with police and the Crown, there's funding in place for that. But there's also services in place to help you navigate the court system, which is very important. If you are, many of the traffickers will engrave women with their names or different names to show ownership. And so, part of the recovery of human trafficking is removing that tattoo. And so that is covered. And of course, because that helps with recovery. If they need addictions or mental health support, that's also covered. And so the way to think about this is it's not just helping victims through the criminal system, it's helping them with things like being able to get new ID, help them go to a doctor's or health appointment of any kind so they feel safe and there's someone with them to guide them along that process. And so all of that is being funded under the victim services that we announced at $20 million, which is so crucial. And to think about it, it's anywhere from training more staff, for instance, on how to help the services. Part of it's also training police officers and police staff to know the different signs and how to help victims so they don't feel that they're not being re-victimized by law enforcement, certainly.
Wow, there's so many ways that the government is involved in fighting trafficking. And so you mentioned the justice system, and then you also mentioned education and Indigenous support services. So in what ways is the government supporting Indigenous people who are trafficked? We know the statistics range, but yes, between 50 to 70% of people who are trafficked in Canada are Indigenous. So what supports and services is the government supporting?
Right, well, some of the work that you did in your research was identifying some of the vulnerable populations. And certainly, when you look at vulnerable youth or vulnerable populations and people who are going to be prying on certain communities, you need to address all aspects of communities in Ontario. Indigenous communities being very important at the pivotal point. So of that $20 million victim service fund, there's also $3 million dedicated specifically to Indigenous communities. That isn't to say they can't use the other victim service funds that we have. Certainly they have full access to that, but that specific $3 million fund is to help them navigate the different delivery models so that they understand the cultural significance of different Indigenous communities and also understand that there's going to be picked people that they can learn firsthand from. So part of that fund is also learning from people who've already come out of the system who are from Indigenous communities, and so they can learn from people who have escaped and kind of know the first steps and that there's hope. So certainly that's very important. But there's also the educational side of it, both in Indigenous communities, the education, but across Ontario. We need to educate our children early on to identify healthy relationships and what to look out for. So, part of our government's curriculum changes we did announce was understanding what healthy relationships are. So you're not in an abusive relationship, but you're also not at the risk of being trafficked, and knowing the signs of trafficking and sex trafficking, so that they understand if their friend or someone or some guy says, let's go to Toronto. I had a lady come into my office and, like middle-class family, no history of abuse, technically not your vulnerable population, as we were speaking about earlier, just a girl who's looking to, get her education and move on with life. Her daughter almost became trafficked. She met a guy who started taking her to parties in Toronto, had a lot of fun, he had a car, and suddenly she started noticing these trends as a mother, and she didn't know what to do. She went running, she didn't and so those supports for parents to educate society and parents to know, where do you go, who do you call, what do you do? She's at the risk of losing her daughter. Like, what if she got kidnapped the next day? And so I ended up speaking to her, and she's very interested in raising more awareness at things like rock concerts and stuff where there's going to be a lot of kids there, so that they know that we're in Simcoe County is a great community, but we're also very very kind people. But there's people who are going to prey on that kindness. We've got to be vigilant. So enforcing that in our educational curriculum is very key.
Well, you touched on so many important and valuable things. And one of the things when you were sharing that story of the mom and her daughter is, there are cases where there's no risk factors, so to speak, present in someone being trafficked. One of the biggest vulnerabilities I read in a report from the Canadian Women's Foundation is wanting to be loved, right? And who doesn't want to be loved? And it's so important to ensure that there's education about healthy relationships. Friends don't demand repayment from friends for gifts, right? And just recognizing boundaries and emotional safety and who to seek support from, who is a safe person to call, and what supports exist. So education on that front is really important. What else is the province doing to help raise awareness in the province of Ontario?
So we are trying to obviously raise more awareness about the victim services that exist. Part of the roundtables we had was inviting all the different service providers, because they're the ones on the front line. If they're not aware of these services, how do they help those impacted? And how do we ensure that we have wraparound care? So a lot of it was working with victim service providers, ensuring that there's wraparound care. Like I was saying, helping someone really pull them out of trafficking so they feel that full support, and we can continue having them out of the trafficking and the sexual abuse rather than having them pulled back in. That's very important. The other important thing is education, right? I think we demanded upon our political leaders to take action, be vigilant, and recognize this as heinous behavior and heinous acts. But creating laws and legislation and have political activism is just one step of the pie. We need public awareness. We need groups of people to rally, whether it's Project Maple Leaf, which used to be Project En Route, and rally around and raise awareness, just like what you're doing on this show. We obviously have the human trafficking awareness in February as well, and so that's a great opportunity to go into the schools. People who want to do something about the issue, raise it in their communities. It takes all of us to know that this isn't just happening around the world; it's happening in our own backyard. 2/3 of these individuals are from the province of Ontario, according to the RCMP and Statistics Canada, and that we've got to do something about it. And so it takes all of us to be vigilant. And the city of Barrie, I know there was a few groups that got together as a Barrie Women's Organization of Business. They try to do a lot of support for human trafficking. And of course, we had other events, whether it's with Grant Thompson, which is of course an accountant firm, but they raised awareness about FinTrack and the financial aspects of following the money. So there's different communities. Just because you're not in victim services doesn't mean you don't have a role in doing something. Each and every one of us, we're human beings We have a heart, we care, we have a soul. We owe it to the next society, the next generation of individuals to do something about it and raise awareness.
And I really appreciate you saying that, because you don't have to be an expert in this issue, or a police officer, or a politician. Anyone can get involved and do something to fight human trafficking, to be an advocate for change, to raise awareness. And I'm so grateful that the province of Ontario has a human trafficking awareness day, where we're saying, we're going to take a day to ensure that the public knows this is something that's happening, and we want to end this. We want this crime to end. So what do you think would be really important to share in terms of maybe something that the provincial government is currently working on to combat human trafficking?
Yeah, so we have an entire website dedicated to human trafficking, so individuals can learn about the signs of human trafficking and the numbers to call, so they can self-educate themselves to share that education. And then what we've done on that website is, if someone actually ends up going on that website who is a victim, we have a part of it that shows them how to erase their website search history, so that we protect them, which is really important. And so having that knowledge that we can educate other Ontarians and share that information is going to be very important. There's going to be a lot of more changes coming down the pipe when it comes to an Ontario-wide strategy on anti-human trafficking and sex trafficking. There's going to be a lot more curriculum changes coming out, and so it'd be great to have support from all Ontarians on those types of initiatives and to share them. It's one thing if we do the work, as I was saying, as legislators and politicians, but we need everyone to raise awareness and rally around this form of modern day slavery. And whether it's you and doing a great show, or doing other social media campaigns, rallying in community areas, we often see strength in numbers really works, but we have to do more. Like, if we know someone is going to be doing a heinous act like sex trafficking, is there ways we can revoke their license? Is there a demand from the community to do these types of policies? And it's when we stop talking about it is when we fail. So we do need to keep talking about it, and it can't just be political leaders, it's got to be everyone in society.
Yeah, dialogue is so important. And kind of when I'm hearing you share, I think of participatory action, right? There's one thing to, be excited about and thankful for the government doing these changes, but it's up to the responsibility of each individual citizen and Canadian to advocate, to raise awareness, and to help make the society that we want to see for our children and our grandchildren for the next generation. Exactly. So could you briefly share one way that our viewers could get involved to help fight human trafficking here in Simcoe County?
Sure. I mean, a great example is when we do have our day of awareness for human trafficking, certainly keep your eyes peeled to different events around the community that are going to be focused on that awareness. Support different women's organizations who raise awareness about that. There's a lot of violence against women groups in our local area in Simcoe County. And then there's the Day of Violence Against Women Day, where there's a march around City Hall. And those types of events are a great way to raise the importance of standing up against human trafficking and these types of acts against females specifically, even if it impacts other genders as well. But to participate and look out for those types of events and show support. Because if it's just me coming out there with a few people, it's great, I know about it and those people, but it's always bringing other people that may not know about it, and you can pass on that education. That will go a long way. So just rallying up as a community, joining different community groups who are doing a lot of work on it would go a long way.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea, for taking the time out of your schedule and day to be a part of this conversation and to raise awareness on human trafficking and share a bit about what the provincial government is doing to fight human trafficking. Thank you so much for tuning in to watch Freedom Fighters Code Grey. If you know someone that is being trafficked, or if you are being trafficked and you're in immediate danger, please call 911. Otherwise, please call our Canadian National Human Trafficking Hotline at 1-833-900-1010. Again, that's 1-833-900-1010, where you can receive information and support. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we hope to catch you next time.
victim, that you're trying to come out of the human trafficking world. And there's an anecdotal a victim, that you're trying to